Hi, and welcome to The Caption Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the more controversial events in the history of comics, and that is the creation of the Comics Code Authority. As many of you know, I just recently got back into comics about 5 years ago, and this was an organization I knew nothing about growing up. So when I first heard about this, I became really interested in learning more about it. So joining us today is an expert on this particular topic to help us understand this organization a little bit more. So please welcome David Hajdu. David is an award-winning cultural historian, critic, and novelist. His books include The 10-Cent Plague, The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America, and The Revolution and the Three Acts, of work of graphic nonfiction with art by John Carey. He is a professor at Columbia University and a member of the National Council of the Humanities. His first published work was an original comic strip, The Endless Odyssey of Skip Toomaloo, published in his high school newspaper. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks a whole lot for having me, Sean. I'm very, very happy to be here to talk comics with you.
And I am very happy to have you on here. As I mentioned, I literally know very, very little about this organization. I know that as a comic book fan, this is one of the things that's part of the history of the comics industry that everyone who is interested in comics should really get to know about. And so I thought, what better way to talk about this than somebody who's actually literally wrote the book on this. And so I'm very excited to have you on the show. One of the first questions I want to ask you, which is kind of a same question I ask all my guests on the show, is what is your comic book origin story? Or if you want to kind of flip it around a little bit, what was your origin story with the Comics Code Authority? Either one of those will be fine.
Well, I was a circus acrobat. I was in the Flying Haydus. No, that's a different one.
Okay.
I inhaled hard water. Oh no, that's the Golden Age Flash. I fell in a vat of yogurt. That's the '60s Plastic Man origin. So,
right.
The origin of my interest in comics. There are a couple levels to it. The basic level is my parents both read comics in the Golden Age, but my older brother was a big comics enthusiast, and he's 9 years older than me. So I grew up in the '60s. I'm a couple years younger than you, and with this older figure who I idolized, so I wanted to do whatever he did. If he read Chaucer, I would have read 14th century English literature. Fortunately, he read comics, so I read comics, and I inherited his comics for a while, and never thinking they might be valuable. He had the first issue of the original of the Justice League. He had the showcase introduction of the Silver Age Flash. He had the introduction of the Silver Age Green Lantern. The Atom, Metamorphose, the Spectre, all those great '60s DC introductions or reintroductions he had. So I grew up on that. So it kind of overlaps with my interest in comics history and even the Comics Code. Because the events that I wrote about in this book, I spent years writing this book, you can see it's kind of thick, which deal with the hysteria over comics content in the post-war years that, reached full bloom in 1948 and then reached a crisis point in the mid-50s, 1954, 1955, took place right before I was born, a couple of years before I was born. And the Comics Code is elemental to all this. It's central to all this. So I'm born into the world when the Comics Code dictated comics content. So I'm born into a world of comics that are really a product of the code. I would say for better or worse, but it was mostly for worse for some time. So I was curious about this. Everybody's curious about, the world around them,
Hmm.
and so I was curious about the world of comics around me, and that led me to make this study. And fortunately, it's a it's a story of history. Fortunately, it's a story that's before your time, and it's now also very much before the present time, but one that I think has a lot of lessons for us
Hmm.
and lessons for the culture. They don't always apply to comics specifically, but there are lessons that appeal to popular culture and to art for young people, for young readers, and art that challenges the status quo, whether it's comics or whether it's video games or whether it's some new form that hasn't even been invented yet. There are deep lessons of from the comics code that carry over to all those forms and forms that haven't been invented yet. So that's my origin story. The Flying Graysons, Chaucer, and my brother.
I love that. Well, and thank you, especially to your brother, for introducing you to comics. And I think your experience with Comics Code Authority is a great segue into that question. For those of us who don't know much about that or don't even know what it is, tell us a little bit of maybe
Yeah.
like a brief description of what the Comics Code Authority
Yeah.
is and how it got started.
You need to keep in mind a few things that predated the comics code that led to the comics code to fully understand it.
Okay.
In the 1940s, and particularly the late 1940s, comics um, had originally been geared to adolescents and to young readers, grew up like in sync with its original readers. So that by the late 1940s, and the comics had very mature content and were really geared for someone who had been, you know, somewhere between 8 and 10, or in 1937, 38, 39, when Batman and Superman come 38, 39,
Hmm.
when the first superheroes come up, that's now a young adult. So it became content for young adult.
Hmm.
That means sophisticated, daring, dealing with adult content, dealing with you know all the temptations that we face when we're adults. And it's stories of it also often took the form of stories of you know of of crime and horror stories and romance stories that weren't that mushy, that were really kind of very complex. So this comics grew up uh, and caught the attention of the government and uh, PTAs, church groups, and other protectors of like propriety, societal propriety,
Hmm.
and uh, they started to clamp down on comics. This is usually attributed to one figure named Frederick Wortham. That's a mistake. He came along and exploited it, and he's handy as, okay, we want a bad guy. He's a
Hmm.
great bad guy. He embodies the evil that this campaign against comics really represented. But there was much more to it than Frederick Wortham, and it began before Frederick Wortham. So
Hmm.
by 1948, there are over 50 laws restricting the sale of comics, or restricting comics content on the books or in the state houses around the country or in municipalities.
Hmm.
50 laws. Kids are being led to gather their comic books and burn them in oblational fires. I have here
Wow.
this I have the yearbook from a I could I should have dog-eared this page. This is the original yearbook, St. Patrick's Academy from 1949. This is a moment from 1948 where the students are being led to burn their comics.
Oh, wow.
And events like this took place all over the country.
No
New,
kidding.
New York, New Jersey, Wisconsin, uh, Oregon, like all over the country. thousands of kids are being led to burn their comics. And there's an intense clampdown on comics. The
Mm-hmm.
comics industry is fearing for its life, and justifiably.
Mm-hmm.
The memory of similar set of events in Hollywood is fresh in the mind of comics publishers.
Mm-hmm.
And someone they either remembered or heard about the origin of the comics production code. There's a production code
Mm-hmm.
that Hollywood. I said comics production code. I meant to say the Hollywood production code.
Gotcha.
Hollywood instituted a production code to prevent the government from taking action. In 1915, the Supreme Court upheld a state body in Ohio that was censoring film content. Went
Mm-hmm.
all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld it, said the states have the right to censor films. Hollywood's in a panic over this. They formed their own production organization, or the Hayes Office and the Production Code, to preemptively soften film content to prevent the government from acting. So it was a preemptive act of self-censorship to prevent what they thought would be harsher government censorship.
Mm-hmm.
1948, with all this in mind,
Mm-hmm.
the comics publishers organized what was originally called the the Association of Magazine Publishers of America, the AMCA, the Association of Magazine Publishers of America, 1948. National, later DC, doesn't join. Timely, Atlas, later Marvel, doesn't join. The organization doesn't have any teeth. It dissolves. Nothing really happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gesture to show we take this seriously. We want to act. We'll form an organization, but it falls apart. After it falls apart from 1948 to 1954, attacks against comics just intensify. So much so that there are Senate hearings on the horror of comics. There are primetime TV programs, half-an-hour TV programs on how comics are poisoning youth, that they're responsible for juvenile delinquency.
Mm-hmm.
They must be stopped. Comics are an evil. They must be stopped. And this is just intensifying.
Mm-hmm.
So now the comics industry unites again, but now everybody joins up. So
Right.
now they're really in a panic.
Mm-hmm.
The Comics Magazine Association of America forms a production code. They're thinking, well, we're going to prevent government censorship. We'll start our own production code.
Mm-hmm.
The production code that they created was much harsher than anything the government would ever have done. It is mind-blowing in its severity.
Interesting.
Let me share with you just a couple of the restrictions, okay?
Okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions, that's pretty broad, should not be presented in a way as to create disrespect for established authority. No disrespect for established authority. No comic shall explicitly present the unique details and methods of a crime. You can't present the methods or details of a crime, even in the process of solving that crime. That means a Sherlock Holmes story couldn't be presented because it
Right.
presents methods of a crime.
Right.
No magazine shall use the word horror or terror in the title. That's just a way to eliminate like 30 titles.
Mm-hmm.
All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted. Okay, well, depravity is a little broad. All lurid, unsavory illustrations shall be eliminated. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with The Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolves are not permitted. Werewolves.
Hmm.
Oh, no Wolfman. Okay.
Right.
Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden. Words or symbols that have acquired undesirable meanings. Well, awfully broad. Passion or romantic interest shall never be treated in such a way as to stimulate the lower and baser emotions. The treatment of love romance stories shall emphasize the value of the home and the sanctity of marriage. Respect for parents, the moral code, and for honorable behavior shall be fostered.
Hmm.
And there's more. There are how many explicit terms, concluding with there are 41 requirements. What did I read? Like eight?
Right.
Eight or
Yeah.
nine? There are 41 of them. And then at the end, the code says this: all elements or techniques not specifically mentioned here, but which are contrary to the spirit and intent of the code and are considered violations of good taste and decency shall be prohibited. So nothing could be published short of like Nancy. Well, actually, Nancy has some pretty, they solved crimes in Nancy, actually.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Uh, Sluggo was homeless.
Hmm.
He lived alone without his parents.
Yeah.
So you could publish practically nothing. Okay, so the comics publishers think we'll put up a front. We'll create this code.
Hmm.
Keep the politicians away. They hired an enforcer named Charles F. Murphy,
Hmm.
and he actually took it seriously and actually enforced it. And
Hmm.
that's when the bottom fell out. So that he actually enforced the code.
Right.
1954, 55, half of American publishers went out of business. They just went out of business. Hundreds of people lost their livelihoods.
Hmm.
Never went back to comics again. And comics were not the same for a very long time. They were absolutely gelded,
Hmm.
because every comic had to have that seal. Now, I interviewed hundreds of people for my book. It's a study of all this, and one of the artists said to me, "Well, why don't we just publish what we want? Do we need that seal of approval? I have some comics up there with the seal I could pull down if you want to see them. Do we need that seal of approval?" And editor said, "Well, without the seal of approval, we can't get the comics printed because
Hmm.
printers won't print them without the seal.
Right.
The distributors won't carry them without the seal. Retailers won't sell them without the seal. We're dead. Comics as we know." This is a quote, direct quote. No, comics as we know it are over. And it
Hmm.
looks like they were for some time.
Right.
It was terrible. Can I tell you some of the things that they did? Some of the things that the Comics Code did?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Every publisher who was a member of the Comics Magazine Association of America, that meant all the major publishers, had to submit scripts and roughs in advance before the final comics are rendered, and then had to submit the final pages before they're printed.
Hmm.
Horrible situation. And so this body of censors were rejecting stories left and right. You know,
Hmm.
artists would come in, editors would come in with a pile, and they'd leave with like a pile like this.
Oh
Just
man.
ridiculous stories.
Yeah.
Sometimes that they're allowing the stories to get through, but in a censored way. They're
Hmm.
blacking out language.
Hmm.
They're actually not blacking out; they're whiting it out, which had
Right.
the
Right.
weird effect of seeming even worse than the original dialogue. There's an example. There's some of these comics that got through in an edited form are now in the hands of collectors, and we've seen them. Like there's one case where it's a romance comic, and the guy, like the wolf, is asking, flirting with a girl,
Hmm.
young woman, and he says, "Oh, hi," and there's a long blank. You know, would you like to do that? It's like a long blank. He was just asking her to go for a swim or something.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we don't know. So this just stimulates the imagination, and the imagination of a lot of people, maybe even me, is worse than was ever on than was surely worse than was ever on that page.
Right. Yeah.
They blacked out weapons, blacked out, you know, uh, there's scenes where, somebody's stabbing somebody with a knife and the knife is blacked out, but they kept the wound, so it looks like somebody had been stabbed with couple fingers.
Those are powerful fingers.
Fingers. And all the bad guys, mobsters, gangsters, you know, anybody who's like kind of dark, doing up to no good, their features were all softened.
Mm.
So instead of a receding hairline, the bad guy would have like a full head of hair. Instead of having a couple days growth of beard, like you do, you'd be a great bad guy in a '50s comic. You'd
Right.
be clean shaven.
Mm.
So now all the bad guys look sympathetic. It
Hmm.
had the absolutely opposite of the
Effect.
effect, the intent.
Right.
You women's breasts were reduced or removed if it's a three-quarter view, so a woman only had one breast instead of two. It was horrible, and it continued for some time. I think the first comic without the code, you probably know this as well as I do, was a Spider-Man from 1971
Hmm.
that Stan Lee wrote a drug story. It was about
Right.
but it was like an anti-drug story. It's a story about the horrors of drugs. But he thought, well, we can't publish this with the code. So it was actually the first comics from a mainstream publisher published without the code, 1971.
Hmm.
Of course, there was no restriction from portraying drugs because in 1954, drugs weren't on the mind of the.
Right.
Another weird thing about the code was the explicit details about the rendering of the female form,
Okay.
but nothing about men.
Right. Yep.
So women could not be depicted in where their anatomy was accentuated,
Hmm.
but men's anatomy could be accentuated.
Right.
So the bulges in the crotch area were fine, but no breasts. So
Right.
comics got kind of more and more homoerotic. You know, they
Right.
just guys just got beefier and beefier, and the women just got.
Right. Again, opposite effect of what they were going for.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So it's interesting to hear you talk about how some of the early codes said something like, no werewolves or vampires or anything like that. And then with you talking about, the Spider-Man story that got published in 1971, obviously along the way, those things weren't as enforced or they got changed because, now in the comics we have a bunch of vampires and werewolves
Right.
and Walking Dead and things like that. So how did that transformation really take place and to where we know today? Because we know that all the major publishers have banned that now, like and
Right.
no one follows that. But like, how did that transformation happen?
Uh, what happened was in the early comics continued to be pretty heavily censored, but there was a drift away from the intense censorship of the late '50s and early '60s.
Hmm.
a steady drift away where comics got just a little more serious and a bit more darker.
Hmm.
But still, we're pretty clean
Right.
until the early 60s. This left wide open the opportunity for comics to deal with more complex, mature, darker subject matter.
Hmm.
That's what spawned underground comics in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. A generation of people had grown up with EC and those pre-code comics.
Hmm.
Generation of people who were kids had grown up exposed to the darkest comics from the pre-code era. They had these memories. They had these memories of EC, and those comics became of age to start writing and drawing comics themselves, couldn't do that kind of thing in mainstream comics, created underground comics.
Hmm.
So underground comics kind of picked up the uh, doing the work of the serious, challenging work that mainstream comics were no longer permitted to do.
Hmm.
So underground comics came along. Shift in the culture commensurate with that, and by the 70s, comics publishers were just starting to feel like, maybe we could start to wiggle out of this. Maybe we
Hmm.
could move away from the code, and maybe no one will. It's not being enforced as much as it used to be. Maybe we
Right.
can get away with it. So comics writers and artists just try bit by bit. We're testing the waters and get away with more and more and more, and to the point where everybody just started ignoring the code, and the code just essentially disappeared. But
Hmm.
you're lucky to have not. I mean, I grew up in the '60s.
Right.
I'm reading DC comics with, like, they have to fill those pages. So, like, there's 17 different colors of kryptonite.
Right.
Each
Yeah.
one does some other wacky thing. And Batman has like little Batmite, and there's Mr. Mxyzptlk and Super Monkey and Super Horse and Super Cat.
Right.
Like, they gotta fill the pages and with more and more and more silliness. I have to admit, I have a soft spot for that stuff. I love the bottled city of Candor, and I love the Fortress of Solitude, and I like a lot of that wacky stuff.
Hmm.
But it's not work you could grow into, unless you maintain this sense of juvenile fun.
Right. So, so my last question for you then, about the Comics Code Authority is, with where we're at now,
Mhm.
um, what is some of the lasting effects of the Comics Code Authority that we still feel now, or if there's any at all that would be good for us to know as we're moving forward into the future of comics and everything? What's something that we should be mindful of with the
Uh,
Comics Code Authority?
I think the lessons of the code authority apply to other forms now.
Gotcha.
I think comics are so free. DC just introduced the black line, so I still read comics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's DC Black, and the whole thing. The comics code. They would have like burned those comics. They wouldn't have been published.
Hmm.
Uh, eh, oh, another thing. Yeah, did I say that? Yeah, yeah. So yeah, in the '70s, a lot of the mainstream comics artists, I grew up with EC, and so we start to see even mainstream comics get like a little darker and more serious. But so the lessons now are lessons for people who make video games, and
Hmm.
TikTok, uh, memes. I mean, other forms.
Hmm.
I think comics are good now.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's a little too much. It, I think there's a little too Marvel has too much power.
Uh-huh.
No, another thing again, but I'm like, I don't like any centralized body having quite so much power,
Right. Right.
no matter who it is.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, but I don't. Yeah, I think that the lessons of comics of the comics code are still make fascinating reading. So, and there's a
Hmm.
lot more to it than we had time to discuss here. And I would, my book's out in paperback now, and
Hmm.
you could get it on Amazon used for $1.50.
Hmm.
So there's going to be a movie version.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I can't say anything more than that, but it's I'm
is
pretty excited about it.
is it
But
going to be like a? Can you say if it's going to be like a narrative or a documentary?
a documentary. No, 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 no,
Awesome.
narrative. No, a narrative
Oh,
like
narrative. Okay.
like a multi-series, a multi-part TV thing.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it.
Congrats. Yeah, that's so
Thank you very
great.
much.
Well, and I think, one of the things I've seen as a consumer with one of the lasting effects of Comics Code Authority is that a lot of comics do their own self-regulation in terms of letting readers and parents know as well too the ratings of it, right? Like, with video games, when Mortal Kombat came
Right,
out, that's whole reason why they started having these rating system with video games, with music. But comics kind of did that, and they fell into doing the same thing by saying, like, is this rated for children, or is this for teens,
right.
or is this 17 plus, things like that. So I think that's going to be a permanent thing moving forward in the
Yeah,
future
yeah.
as well. So well, David, thank you very much for joining the show and talking to us a little bit more about Comics Code Authority and give us the history of this. And for those who are interested in the book, I'll make sure to provide a link to the book in the show notes as well too. And again, it's called The 10-Cent Plague, which I absolutely love that title. That's very, very on the nose description of that. I think
I
that's
I
fantastic.
made it
Yeah.
up myself. It sounds like something I found. And I'm not trying to sell books, so I'm not gonna make any money on the used copies, but
Right.
you can get it used pretty cheap now, and
Right.
it's in a lot of libraries too.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, before I let you go, where can we find you and your work online?
Well, I write, mostly about music and comics, but more about music.
Hmm.
So, I'm the music critic for The Nation, magazine called The Nation. It's online. Oh, look up my website, davidhajdu.com, and there are links to everything there.
Okay.
Just yeah.
I'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well too. So
Alright.
awesome.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, David. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. This is fun.
Yeah. And for the final segment of this episode, we're going to end with the comics that we're reading. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you may notice that we didn't have that segment, and that's because we had some time constraints. So I'm going to include in this episode the comics that people have shared what they're going to read last week as well. And so we're going to do some sort of doubling up, but I'm going to share with you what I'm currently reading and also share what listeners have chimed in on what they're reading for this week as well, too. So currently I am reading a book called The Human Target by Tom King and Greg Smallwood from DC Comics. And it's actually going to be wrapping up soon with 12 issues. And initially, I was not really interested in this book, but one of my colleagues from Comic Watch, Anthony Bergamini, had actually suggested reading this for episode for next week. So stay tuned for that. But he wanted to do an episode on this to kind of do a deep dive and analysis and talk about this issue and this run. And I read 3 books so far, and I absolutely love it. It's a lot of fun. The art is really fantastic. It's really cool. Kind of gives that spy thriller kind of sense from the 70s and 80s. And it just has a really great artistic look to it, including the colors. The story is fantastic. I find myself laughing and really intrigued. And honestly, I can't wait to read the next book. And so it's one of the few books I've been able to, and I haven't been able to put down in all honesty. Now, Tom King is somebody that's kind of a hit or miss for me. I've read some of his works that I absolutely love. I've also read some of his other works that didn't really resonate with me. I didn't really enjoy, but I got to say The Human Target is one that I'm absolutely falling in love with, and I cannot wait to read more about that. So let's go ahead and see what some of our listeners have also been reading this week. And this actually comes from who I mentioned before, Anthony Bergamini. And he said that he's reading All-Star Superman. He's not a huge fan of Grant Morrison's writing, so I've been putting off reading after several failed attempts to read past the second issue. I finally dove in, and it's a lot better than other works of theirs. I'm not sure if I agree with the popular opinion that it's the best Superman comic of all time, but it's definitely good to read. I'll be honest, I've not read that issue or that run. I am a fan of Grant Morrison's writing, so I'm kind of sad to hear that Anthony is not a fan of his. But I know for me, Grant Morrison, I absolutely love his run on Klaus from Boom Studios, and I absolutely love that. And so I've read a few of his works. I haven't given All-Star Superman a chance yet. I'll put it on my to-read list at some point. But this is really interesting to hear. So thank you for sharing that, Anthony. Next, from another colleague from Comic Watch is B. Rat. B. Rat says that they're reading the now classic Bob Harris, Steve Epting Avengers era. Full on scruffy Black Knight, bomber jackets. Crystal and Cersei are the two powerhouses, while the male members are a tad more subdued power-wise. Epting, while Raw, has loads of potential just brimming. This is another series I've not read yet. This is something from, I think, the 70s, if I remember correctly. But thank you for sharing that. The Avengers is always a good hit. Black Knight and Crystal and Cersei are characters that I did not know were actually part of the Avengers at one point. So this is really cool. And this is one of the fun things about doing this show is that I get to learn more from comics from you all. So thank you very much for sharing that. Next colleague from Comic Watch, Matt Meyer, who's our editor-in-chief. And he said that he is currently reading The Incredible Hulk by Bill Mantlo and Sal Buscema. Never revolutionary, just good, solid meat and potatoes Hulk. And I got to say, I love this cover right here. I have no idea whose foot that is. I got to read this sometime, but I always love reading the Hulk whenever I get a chance. And this, just the cover by itself, just shows me that I need to read this because this looks very, very interesting. I want to see who is bigger than the Hulk in this issue. Last from Comic Watch is our own commentator, Tyler Davis. And they said that they're playing the trade catch-up game this week. They're reading Taylor's Nightwing, Noctera, and reading Saga for the first time. I've read a couple of issues of Nightwing from Tom Taylor. Absolutely love it. Tom Taylor is one of those writers that I can read any of his stuff and just really enjoy. I'm a big fan of his. Noctera is one I've been meaning to get around to. I think it's written by Scott Snyder, and I absolutely love Scott Snyder's work. Saga is one that I've tried reading the first issue. I never could really get into it. I know that a lot of people say that Saga is fantastic. There's a lot of people that love that, and I apologize that I don't. I just haven't been able to really get into it. But thank you for sharing that. I think these are all great works, and I appreciate you taking the time to share that with us, Tyler. Next, Comic Concierge shared that he is currently reading Dead Enders as I try to catch up with all the Ed Brubaker books I haven't read. Ed Brubaker, I've read a few of his works. I have not read this one yet, but the cover looks really interesting here with the fact that there's some guy on a moped, looks like he's really pissed. That's really interesting. I've never heard of this before. It's DC Vertigo, so this was pre-Black Label, but it's supposed to be more the mature reading part. So this is really interesting to hear. So thank you for sharing that, Comic Concierge. Next, Joe Loves Comics said finishing Justice League Darkseid War and Murder Falcon, also reading Crowded Volume 1 from Image Comics. And right now, I have the cover for the Darkseid War here. I have not read any of the Darkseid War issues here, but from looking up, it looks like there is an issue that's dedicated to each of the members of Justice League. So this really sounds interesting. I'd love to learn more about this. So thank you very much for sharing that. Joe Loves Comics. Next is Ken from the ODPH podcast. He said he is catching up on Spider-Man, the new Superman by Williamson and Campbell. Specs from Boom Studios. The finale is next week, which I think he said that last week, so it should be coming out this week. The Sins of Sinister spinoffs from Marvel and Supermassive 1 with news of Supermassive 2 details being released. I absolutely love this current run of Spider-Man. I'm not somebody that put Spider-Man on his pull list, but I actually reviewed the first issue of this run for Comic Watch, and I absolutely fell in love with it. It's something that, again, I'm a casual fan of Spider-Man. It's not one I pick up for current reading, but this one from Dan Slott and Scott Bagley, they're just fantastic in this run, and I cannot wait to keep reading the next issue. I've actually just finished reading this one, and I absolutely just been loving everything that they've been doing here. And then the Sins of Sinister spinoffs, I have been reading the Nightcrawlers and the Immoral X-Men I just finished. And again, X-Men is one of those things where they have all these spinoffs, and so it's really hard to keep up with everything. But what I've been enjoying about these is that you can kind of read them, and they are kind of self-contained for the most part, as long as you get the idea of like what's going on in the bigger realm of things with Krakoa and the X-Men and all that. I have not had a chance to read the Storm spinoff series, but the Immoral X-Men and Nightcrawlers have been fantastic, so I definitely recommend that. So thank you for sharing that, Ken. Next is Spectacular CT says just started reading The Boys. It was very 2000s. Funny, but it got real problematic real quick. I can only imagine that. I have not read The Boys. I've watched the show. I'll be honest, the show is written very well. I just cannot stomach the show from time to time, just because it gets a little bit more grotesque and just a little bit gross to my liking. So I know a lot of people appreciate The Boys and they really enjoy it. Like I said, I think it's really well written. I think it's really fascinating, and the acting is fantastic. I love all the actors in there, and the cast is just overall, I think, spot on for some of the characters that they're writing here. But like I said, it's just not a series for me. So I imagine that the comic series is not for me as well too. But thank you very much for sharing that. And last but not least, we have Wally. Wally says they're reading Monstrous and Radiant Black because I have listened to so many reviews on TikTok. I caved and bought them. So far, so good on both titles. I've heard great things about Radiant Black, and I've been meaning to read that. I've not heard about Monstrous, but this looks really interesting just from the cover itself. I don't know what's going on here. It looks like it's a little bit from the fantasy side, maybe Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe, again, this is just based on the cover I'm looking here, but this looks really interesting. So thank you very much for sharing that. And that is our segment, Comics We're Reading, for this week. Thank you, everybody, for chiming in and letting us know what you're reading. I hope some of these recommendations and what people are reading inspired you to maybe check out a new title for this week. And that wraps up another episode of The Caption Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Caption Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecaptionlife.com.